The Ogre Kingdoms are located in the mountains of Morn, far to the east of most of the civilized lands of the Empire. Lying further to the east than even the World's Edge Mountains, the Mountains of Morn is a vast area of land almost entirely covered in mountains and hills, with only a handful of passable routes leading through it to the lands of Cathay beyond. It is on one of these few routes, the Silver Road, that the Ogre Kingdoms lie, and it is because of this very road that the Ogre Kingdoms are centered in this area, as they can levy a harsh toll from anyone wishing to trade with the rich kingdoms of Cathay beyond. The Mountains of Morn used to be the homes to a race of intelligent, sentient giants, a far cry from the miserable, stupid beasts of current times. This race named themselves the Sky Giants, and lived in massive cities on the tops of mountains, too high for any human to climb. This seemingly invincible race had conquered vast swaths of the mountains and had subjugated the local Orc tribes and even exterminated many of the more ferocious beasts that used to prowl these areas. And while the Sky Giants in their mighty mountain fastness might have been able to weather the storm of almost any invasion, what finally dislodged them from their mountain homes was no mere invasion, it was a migration. A migration of ogres. The ogres used to live in the border provinces of Cathay, where they were reasonably few in numbers, and were viewed as less of a threat to the great Cathayan Empire, and more as a source of very capable mercenaries to fight its many wars and quell its many rebellions. However, as the ogre tribes grew in numbers, they started to raid into the lands of Cathay, which was something the Majesty Shen Hung, the celestial dragon emperor, took a very dim view of. Whether Shen Hong's coven of powerful astromancers had anything to do with what happened next is pure speculation, but what we do know is that a massive meteor large enough to blot out the sun and the moon in the sky struck the ogre homelands. In this monstrous impact, 2/3 of the ogre population was instantaneously annihilated, and their homeland laid to ruin and waste by great raging firestorms that lasted for days after the comet's fall, incinerating everything for miles around it. For the handful of battered and bruised tribes that yet lived, the worst had yet to come. Their previously bountiful homeland of endless steppes and fertile earth was now nothing more than a searing desert of howling sandstorms and powerful energies that ripped the flesh from even an ogre's massive bones. But even this was not the greatest catastrophe levelled upon the remaining ogres, now incapable of sustaining themselves via agricultural means. The tribes quickly starved, and with all animals equally so devastated by the comet's fall, the ogres quickly turned to cannibalism to feed themselves. And as they devoured their own kin, a nagging hunger started to set in. They found that no matter how much they ate and ate and ate, they were still hungry. It seemed to the ogres as if an insatiable god had come amongst them the night of the meteor. One particular ogre, Groth Onefinger, was the first ogre to venture into the desert and live long enough for him to reach his final goal, the center of the great meteor's impact. But before him lay not a giant crater blown out of the ground. Before him stretched a gigantic, gaping crater the size of an inland sea, filled with ridge upon ridge of jagged teeth and rippling, convulsing muscle that stretched down and down into nothingness. A gullet so huge it could swallow a race like the ogres, and still hunger for more. It exists there, even now, a vile, pulsating god, visited upon the face of the world by the vengeful gods, and it is this deity that the ogres know as the Great Maw, the very foundation of their religion and their way of life. And to this day many ogres follow in Groth's footsteps, attempting the pilgrimage to the Great Maw, although very few indeed ever return from that spot. Many of them suspected to have hurled themselves into the Great Maw upon arriving, called by a persistent nagging in the backs of their minds, forcing them to feed the great god. And while the ogres might worship the Great Maw, it is more out of fear than of reverence. The ogres dig staked pits in the ground, which they surround with wooden stakes to emulate the teeth of the Great Maw, into which they throw hunks of rotting meat in an effort to satiate the hunger of their ferocious gods. And they regularly fight to the death in these stinking meat-filled maw pits dug into the earth, as ritualistic sacrifices, hoping to appease the Great Maw and thereby stop it from expanding and once again attempt to devour their race. As futile an effort as it may be, it is the only effort they know of. And it was this great hunger instilled upon them by the Great Maw that drove them into the mountains of Morn, now that they could no longer enter Cathay, due to the vast desert stretching between them that would swallow up and devour even creatures so mighty as ogres should they try to pass it. The Sky Giants, having seen the meteor's impact, felt relieved, now that their once quite dangerous enemy, the Cathayans, were now cut off from them by vast stretches of impassable desert, and therefore were not prepared when thousands upon thousands of ravenous ogres descended upon their once great kingdom, overrunning their mountain halls with sheer weight of numbers and ferocious appetite. The Sky Giants were eaten alive within their very halls that they thought impregnable. The ruins of their once great citadels, now inhabited by ogres and gnoblars and the few travellers brave enough to venture to far-off Cathay, where the mountains of Morn are but one of many obstacles to be crossed for one to acquire the great potential wealth that such trade might bring. The ogres themselves are massive, brutish monstrosities, possessed of massive strength and a grotesque appetite, but very little intelligence, although ogres are by no means stupid. They're just not particularly bright either. Incredibly aggressive and violent creatures, the hunger that drives every single ogre will drive them to eat anything and anyone they can get their hands on, unless motivated by a greater feast or by sheer good old-fashioned fear. In many ways, the ogres bear a striking resemblance to orcs, except while an orc prefers to fight his opponent sheerly for the pleasure of fighting him, an ogre has a more immediate goal in mind when he attacks someone. That being said, ogres will not eat anything and everything simply to eat it. An ogre's loyalty can be bought by simply offering him more food than what is in front of him. An ogre might eat a human mercenary, or a traveller, or one of the many traders that pass through their kingdom, but if the trader offers to keep him well fed, he will just as easily be willing to fight to protect the trader. And indeed, ogre mercenaries are quite common in the Warhammer world, employed frequently within the armies of the Empire, and many other nations, though some will not deal with the ogres entirely due to reasons of, basic hygiene being one of them, as ogres never wash, and the simple good old fear of being eaten, as even the most intelligent and loyal of ogres can still get just a little bit too hungry to look forward to his next meal rather than the one presented right in front of him. Other than food, an ogre's other motivating factor is the same motivation that every living creature has, the motivation to stay alive. Something that the rulers of the Ogre Kingdoms, the Ogre Tyrants, make great use of to keep their ogres in line and ensure that they are working towards the tyrant's greater goal rather than simply filling their own bellies. These tyrants rule the various Ogre Kingdoms that make up the Ogre Kingdoms, not one nation by any means. The ogres are divided into dozens of tribes, scattered all across the Mountains of Morn. The largest kingdom is that of Greece's Goldtooth, a massive, virulent, petulant ogre that rules the largest single concentration of ogres, partially because of his extreme fondness for mindless violence, and also because of the massive amounts of wealth he acquires, as his kingdom sits directly on top of the Silver Road, the safest trade route to Cathay. Though that isn't saying much, it's still safer, by far, than the northern route leading through the Chaos Waste, or the southern route leading through the aptly named Haunted Forest. And while most other ogre tribes will simply attack, eat, and steal whatever the traders carry, Greece's Goldtooth's ogres offer a certain amount of protection and safety to the travelers, in return for a rather considerable amount of their trade. But it is better to give half of your profits to Greece's than it is to give all of your profit and your life to the other ogres. Speaking of other ogres, ogres can generally be divided into several sub-classes, so to say, to use a gamey term, in which tyrants are the rulers of the individual kingdoms and make up the ogre's leadership structure. Ogres, being simple creatures, tend to elect, or rather, the tyrant will elect himself by virtue of being the biggest, strongest, angriest of the ogres, and any ogre can become the next tyrant simply by bashing in the brains of the previous tyrant. However, any tyrant with ambitions to stay tyrant will usually buy the loyalty of several of the other large, big, burly ogres, and use them as a particularly well-fed and thereby loyal bodyguards. These ogres are often known as Iron Guts, and are usually fairly well armoured by ogre standards, wearing cobbled-together pieces of armour taken from their many victims, and tend to wield massive double-handed weapons, in many cases little more than vast slabs of iron, beaten into the rough resemblance of a sword. There aren't that many things that can kill a full-grown ogre, but a weapon the size of an ogre, wielded by some of the biggest and strongest ogres in the tribe, are one of the few weapons that might just be up to the task, and further enforce the Iron Guts' role as somewhat of a police force within the particular Ogre Kingdom. And while the Iron Guts wear armour of a sort, most ogres cannot wear armour simply because they do not have the skill to fashion it, and they are too large to use armour made by other races. The only piece of armour that pretty much every single ogre wears is a so-called gut plate. This is a massive solid piece of iron, steel, or whatever else the ogre can get his hands on, wrapped in front of his prodigious belly. As to an ogre, his gut is his most important body part. An ogre that dies from disembowelment is considered to have forever lost the favour of the Great Maw, and will become an eternal morsel for their angry gods in the afterlife. Not to mention, if he should survive the disembowelment, He will forever be despised and hated by his ogre comrades and would be hunted by them at all times, practically ensuring his death. The vast majority of the Ogre Kingdoms are made up of so-called bulls. The bulls are adult male ogres, and are not strictly of warrior class, but every full-grown ogre is a warrior, partially by necessity, as there are very, very few creatures indeed that inhabit the mountains of Morn not capable of defending themselves, and partially by opportunity, as often the safest way of acquiring food is either to fight for someone willing to feed them, or fight to acquire said food from someone that already possesses it. Being by far the most common type of ogres, they regularly make up the bulk of any ogre army. A step above the bulls are the Bruisers. Bruisers are particularly large and strong ogres, even by ogre standards, and are often used by the tyrant as a ad hoc police force to provide numbers to the Iron Guts' strength. As a police force, they are not particularly effective simply because they are very easily bribed, but better to have some semblance of law and order than none, and if law and order really does need to be particularly upheld in a specific area, the tyrant will either have to see to it himself or use his more loyal Iron Guts. The exception being many of the Bruisers employed by Grease's Goldtooth himself. They are compensated handsomely enough to keep them relatively loyal and relatively interested in doing their job to at least a fairly professional standard. Additionally, they are painfully aware that should they be found wanting in their duties, then odds are good that the next time they find themselves at a banquet, they will be the main course of Grease's Goldtooth's next meal. And while all of the types of ogres mentioned so far rely primarily upon strength of arms and massive size to take care of their victims, there are ogres that have realized that technology has much to offer when it comes to making their next meal easier to acquire. These ogres are usually known as lead belchers. A relatively new type of warrior in ogre society they may be, but one would never underestimate a lead belcher if for no other reason than the fact that a lead belcher's primary weapon is a cannon. And thanks to their massive size and weight, they are able to fire these cannons as two-handed black powder weapons. And while ogres are not particularly good at making anything, and therefore are unable to create cannonballs of any real quality, they are perfectly able to just grab whatever metal junk nearby and shove them down the barrels of their cannons, creating massive shotguns. The cannons themselves are usually acquired from enemy artillery crews unfortunate enough to get that close to a fully grown angry ogre, and some of them are even bought from the Chaos Dwarfs, although the Chaos Dwarves are not the most trustworthy of neighbours, and doing business with them always has a certain element of risk to it, but if an ogre is desperate enough, that is one way to acquire a cannon, or, alternatively, if an ogre is strong enough, there are alternative ways of acquiring cannons from the Chaos Dwarfs. Additionally, cannons tend to be made of solid material, and being quite heavy, make excellent clubs if the action gets up close and personal, and it just so happens that ogres are one of the few creatures in the Warhammer universe strong enough to wield a cannon as a club. Lead belchers are generally considered insane by their fellow ogres because they are carrying a massive tube of black powder with every opportunity to misfire uncomfortably close to their bellies, but the lead belchers themselves consider this a worthwhile risk, in return for lugging around a massive cannon and being able to create lots of fire, smoke, and loud noises on command. Another type of ogre generally considered insane by their fellows are the man-eaters. The name is slightly misleading. The man-eaters are not ogres particularly fond of eating humans, although humans are considered quite the delicacy among the Ogre Kingdoms. The man-eaters are mercenaries. They are ogres that have travelled far beyond the Mountains of Morns, renting out their services as excellent heavy infantry to whomever willing to pay their rather considerable fee and feed them. Man-eaters that return from their mercenary adventures are usually considered elite by the local tyrants simply because man-eaters who have actually gotten back home have been fighting near non-stop for a considerable amount of time, and seeing as they're still alive, they've got to be pretty damn good at it. Additionally, man-eaters are far more used to dealing with humans than most other ogres, and can be used as highly valued advisors and translators in dealing with humans. Because while the ogres have acquired quite a taste for squishy humans, any tyrant with ambition also knows that it pays to befriend some of the humans, and, more importantly, their bulging wallets. Another type of ogre that is generally considered reasonably trustworthy and mercenary by the travellers is the so-called hunter. The hunter is generally an outcast from a tribe that have been sent off into the Mountains of Morn for some perceived slight, perhaps losing a duel, or worst of all, having his gut cut open. They are sometimes employed within ogre armies as a form of mercenary, highly valued for the fact that, while a man-eater has gone off to the civilized world and come back alive, a hunter has been surviving in the Mountains of Morn by himself. And as I mentioned previously, there are very, very few creatures indeed that inhabit the Mountains of Morn that are not more than capable of defending themselves. The last type of ogre is the religious leader of their type, the Butchers. The Butchers are shamans, as well as cooks, and while being a cook might not sound very impressive by most standards, in ogre society someone actually capable of preparing the food to a greater degree than simply hanging it over a fire and searing it is extremely highly valued. They are also mages of a sort capable of using gut magic, a gift granted to them by the Great Maw. And although I call it a gift, gut magic has much in common with greenskin magic in that it is equally liable to kill the caster as it is the targets he's casting them on. However, an ogre is a reasonably resilient creature and can usually take whatever punishment the magic sends back at him. Gut magic is also rather horrendous in that its casting usually requires some form of eating to take place, along with an incantation. And if the Great Maw finds their offering worthy, it will allow the Butcher to cast the spell. If not, he will return the spell right back on the caster. These side effects can vary from a really bad tummy ache to a giant bloody maw bursting forth from the Butcher and devouring him from the inside. A particularly unpleasant way to go, particularly so for an ogre. Other creatures generally associated with the ogres are the Noblars, which are even smaller goblins, usually used as essentially a slave species employed by the ogres because they are small and dexterous, capable of making equipment that the ogres simply cannot make themselves. And while they are particularly disloyal and thieving little bastards, the ogres value their Noblars greatly. Before the Noblars, the Ogre Kingdoms used to employ vast numbers of goblins to do much the same thing. However, a goblin, being larger and stronger than a Gnoblar, had one massive drawback that led the Ogre Kingdoms to employing Noblars instead. The reason being that Noblars, being smaller and weaker than goblins, can't carry off quite as much booty when they inevitably steal from their ogre masters. Additionally, the ogres employ another type of ogre, although it is so different from the other ogres it might as well be considered a subspecies, the Gorgeou. When an ogre is born without a gut, that is considered an extremely bad omen sent by the Great Maw, and so the infant is handed over to the tribe's butcher, who takes the infant to the deepest, darkest part of the nearest cave and throws the infant inside it. The cave is then closed with boulders of tremendous size, and the infant is left presumably then to starve. However, while the vast majority of these infants are found and eaten rather quickly by the denizens of the cave, some, a very, very few, live to grow to maturity, feeding on the rats, fangleashes, crustworms, and any scraps of food that might have gotten their way in there from the ogres above. A full-grown Gorgeou is even more ravenous than an ogre, and will eat anything presented to it. You cannot reason with a Gorgeou, you cannot bribe a Gorgeou with promises of future meals. The Gorgeou will simply eat you. And due to their incredible hunger, they will sometimes be drawn to the scenes of battle, hoping then to feast upon the dead, the dying, and whatever might be alive upon arrival. Many of these Gorgeous are then captured by the ogres, and used essentially as attack dogs, sent off in the general direction of the enemy, as, while quite stupid, the Gorgeous know that they've got a hell of a lot better chance at staying alive and getting something to eat by charging the army in front of them, rather than the army of ogres behind them. Someone else usually attracted to scenes of battle by the ogres are the Yetis. Ferocious beasts armed with weapons of magical ice. How the Yetis come to fight for the ogres is a matter of much speculation, some thinking that they might somehow be magically bound to the ogres, some thinking that they might be an offshoot of the ogres themselves. Whatever the matter, an Ogre Tyrant is able to summon Yetis to war, where they lend their great savagery and strength to the ogre cause. Having heard all this, you might wonder why the Ogre Kingdoms have not long since wandered off into the Empire, filled as it is with fleshy, soft humans and cattle to eat. The reason for this is that, one, the Ogre Kingdoms are divided into so many warring factions that any one tribe, even someone as powerful as Greece's Goldtooth, could at most levy a few hundred, maybe 1,000 ogres, and before reaching the Empire, they have to get across the Howling Wastes, a part of the Warhammer world covered in all manners of natural hazards, first and foremost, and unnatural hazards. It is regularly prowled by the Chaos Dwarfs looking for slaves, and while ogres are a substantially dangerous fighting force, Chaos Dwarfs are not to be sniffed at either. And if they manage to avoid the Chaos Dwarfs, they might run into what the Chaos Dwarfs originally came there to hunt, the huge hordes of orcs and goblins that inhabit the Howling Wastes. And again, while ogres and orcs might have much in common, being both violent, angry, and rather stupid, this also means that there is almost no chance in all living hell that either side will ignore the other. The orcs, because the ogres are big and tough and they'd love to fight them, and the ogres, because the orcs are relatively large, and while not particularly tasty, they're better than eating other ogres. Presuming then that the horde has managed to get past the Chaos Dwarves and the orcs, they then hit the World's Edge Mountains, and now they have to get across the World's Edge Mountains, which means passing through one of the relatively few mountain passes heavily guarded by the dwarfs. So now the horde of ogres is slowly trekking through mountain passes, being bombarded by cannons, crossbows, and all manners of horrible dwarf inventions, not to mention that they're going to have to fight their way through armies of the little bastards before they finally enter the Empire, where they're going to be fighting even more armies of Empire Knights and other nasties. In short, the attrition would be so severe that the only real hope of the ogres ever reaching the Empire and the civilized lands in sufficient numbers to actually inflict harm would be if another great migration takes place, forcing all of the ogres in more or less the same direction. Now that I have hopefully piqued your interest in the Ogre Kingdoms, I hope to see you in my next video, where I'll be discussing how the ogres could be implemented in Total War Warhammer, which, while all of this sounds like they would be a ridiculously hard faction to implement, I think they would actually be one of the simpler factions to implement, and while their position in the Mountains of Morn, so far away from the heart of the action, might prove problematic, implementing them as just a faction could be quite doable. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.